This is the video for Unit 5, Lesson 5, Inverse Functions. So the goal is going to be to determine the inverse of a function and to restrict the domain to make a function invertible. So we've already been using inverses with solving for radical equations when we've been squaring. So now we're going to look at how this looks on a graph and kind of building on what we've seen with square root and cube root graphs. So an inverse function is a function that reverses the operations. So we use our notation that f of negative 1. And so if I do f of negative 1 of x, that's going to just give me x. We're going to find that when we work with our square root functions, so specifically our square roots and our quadratics. Again, those are the ones that are U-shaped. When we do the inverse of a quadratic, if I was to create the inverse, you're going to see the inverse doesn't end up being a function, right? If we solved it, we would actually get plus or minus x squared. So what we're going to do is we're going to restrict our domain so we only get that that square root function we've been working with. So we don't have to worry about a plus or minus. So when we restrict our domain, our quadratic is going to have that hk for the vertex. We're going to restrict it so that we're only using just the top part or the bottom part. So we still have a function when we create the inverse. So again, our big thing is we're not going to see our plus or minus square root. We're just going to see our regular square root we're used to seeing. So the first example is we're going to go ahead and calculate the inverse and restrict the domain if needed. And typically we only need to restrict the domain if we're working with a quadratic, right? Because that's that U shape, or if we're working with an absolute value, but we're not going to see one of those. So if I have an x squared in my f of x equals x squared, or anything with an x squared that I'm starting with, I have to restrict the domain. Otherwise, I'm going to get this C shape that's not going to work out. So for our inverse, what we're going to do is we're going to switch the x and the y. So I'm going to replace instead of f of x, I'm going to write y. And now I'm going to switch x and y up. So I have 3/2 y minus 18. And now we're going to go ahead and just solve for y. And this is going to give us the inverse of that function. So I'm going to add 18. And this is just a linear equation. So this isn't even a radical. This is kind of a review of something we've seen. And then I'm going to multiply both sides by the reciprocal. And then distribute to simplify. So we get 2/3 x plus 12 equals y. So really what we just found was the inverse. So this is the inverse of f of x. So what that means is if I was to go ahead and evaluate f of negative 1 of x, I would actually just end up with x, right? So if I was to substitute that in, it would check out. So we just found the inverse of that function. For question number 2, we're going to see that since this has an x squared, that means it's a quadratic, so I have to restrict the domain. So anytime there's an x squared, the inverse is going to not be a function, so I have to restrict it. The easiest way to do that is we know the vertex for this is -2, -7, which we've seen before in our other videos. And so the domain, I'm going to restrict it to just start where the vertex is, so -2 to infinity. And now I can do the same thing I've done before. I just don't need to put the plus or minus because now we're going to get a function. So I'm going to rewrite this. This is the same as having y. So I'm going to rewrite and switch x and y. So it's x, y plus 2 squared minus 7. And then I'm going to add 7. And then we're going to square root both sides. And so when we square root it, I don't need to put a plus or minus because we restricted the domain, and that's why we did that. So instead of having a plus or minus, like you normally would with solving an equation, I don't have to put that now. And I'm going to subtract 2. And so my inverse is going to be the square root of x plus 7 minus 2. And that's it. And finally, for the last one, we're going to go ahead. We don't need to restrict the domain. So when I look at a cubic, this is a cubic function. The inverse is going to be a cube function, right? So I'm good either way. So now this one, the domain is just going to be all real numbers, so I don't have to restrict it. And now I'm going to go ahead and solve. This is going to be y minus 6. I'm going to cube both sides. Add 6 to both sides. So then this would be our inverse. X cubed plus 6. And then we would be done, right? So if I wanted to see that inverse function, you could see it would be a cubic function. And then it would start it as a cube root function. If you have any questions, you can feel free to ask them in class, sign up for T-Bolt time, or go to the center.